The reason people are failing is not because of their understanding of the underlying technology. They're failing for the same reasons they've been failing since the beginning of digital transformation: a lack of organizational focus, a lack of leadership, a lack of engagement, clarity of strategy, linking the technology to the goals and objectives of the organization. In some ways, it's the same problem.
Welcome to the Regulating AI podcast with Sanjay Puri. AI is changing the world faster than rules can keep up. So how do we protect people without killing progress? Each week, Sanjay brings you inside conversations with global leaders, policymakers, and innovators who are wrestling with that exact question. So if you're curious about the future of technology and how it's governed, you're in the right place. Meet Jeff McMillan, head of Firmwide AI at Morgan Stanley, where he's leading the charge to responsibly harness artificial intelligence across one of the world's most influential financial institutions. With decades of experience at the intersection of data, strategy, and innovation, Jeff brings a rare blend of technical insight and human perspective to how AI is reshaping finance and the world.
Jeff, welcome to Regulating AI. We are truly honored to have you with us.
Sanjay, thanks for having me, and thanks for this podcast. I think this is a really important topic, which candidly doesn't get the airtime that it deserves. So I appreciate your focus on the issue.
What were some of the most critical governance decisions you had to make during this rollout, and how would you advise policymakers who are now really grappling with how to regulate something at such a large enterprise scale around the world?
So the first thing is I would say, and I don't know, for folks who probably don't know much about Morgan Stanley and our journey, we were introduced to OpenAI back in March of 22 as a reference point. That was 7 months before ChatGPT was released upon the world. So we became the first financial services company in the world to work with OpenAI, and we were the first financial services firm to deploy any form of solution on the large language model infrastructure, and that goes back almost 3 years now. And the first thing that I would say, and I think it was true 3 years ago, and I think it's true today, is that these are complicated issues. There is no precedent. So the first piece of advice is that you need to bring all of your constituents to the table. It is not a competition between your business people and your legal and compliance people. It is a partnership. And that partnership requires both a firm understanding of what generative AI is, how it works, the tremendous opportunities, but also the risks. And it also requires an understanding of the business people, what the issues and concerns that your legal and compliance and risk people have. So that would be the first thing. And I would only highlight that is because you're going to have to forge consensus in a world in which there are no prescriptive rules from the regulators. You're essentially solving for a bunch of regulatory principles, which, by the way, in many ways are actually are pretty helpful, but in many cases are not fully adequate to represent all of the issues related to Gen AI. So that would be the first thing, is bring everyone together and make it a joint effort. The second thing is, what we did is, in the absence of clear regulations, we established our own guiding principles. And I think this is really important because you need some sense of ground truth. Like what are the boundaries that you're going to put around this technology? So for example, literally almost on day one, we set up a group of folks and we said, well, what are going to be the parameters that will govern this technology? And I'll just give you some, I'll highlight some of them at the top level. So number one, we agreed that everything that we did with generative AI would be governed and supervised by a senior group of people at the firm, so that there would be full transparency on what people were doing, how they were doing it. We would track and monitor both the intake of issues as well as the results of that work. Number two, everything that we would do is human in the loop. And I know there's lots of talk about agentics and autonomous engines and all that stuff. And I think, oh, that's very interesting. And we can certainly talk about that. But in a regulated institution that requires very high degrees of precision, while the AI is incredibly helpful and enables people to do a better job and do better things faster and sometimes cheaper, the human is ultimately responsible and accountable for the quality of the work. And putting the human at the center of everything that we do, I think, is really important. The third thing is that we require a robust and evaluation framework on everything we do. And I suspect we'll talk more about this. I think one of the things that we've learned is that generative AI is incredibly easy to build and very, very difficult to deploy with high degrees of efficacy. And the reason that is the non-deterministic nature of this technology makes it necessary to put this technology through very robust frameworks, evaluation both automated and manual. And that oftentimes takes a lot of time, effort, and expertise that historically organizations don't have the wherewithal to do. And then the final piece is that there needs to be second line oversight. So while my organization does a lot of interesting things, we build a lot of technology, everything that we do, there is a second line individuals who are responsible for independently validating the efficacy. And I can't go live without a second group of people saying that Jeff McMillan did his job. And to be clear, those people don't work for me. They don't get paid for me. And I think this idea of independence. Now, I don't know if those are all of the things that ultimately firms need to do, and I suspect some of them will change. But I have to be honest with you, we established those rules 3 years ago, and they've stood the test of time, and I think they've served us well. And some variant of them I'd recommend firms adopting because I do think they really give a good basis as people think about deploying this technology in scale. And assume that you won't get it right on the first day, right? I think you have to be willing to make these infrastructures open, flexible, and adaptable. And while you should put a line in the sand at any point in time, every 3 to 6 months, you need to reevaluate and ask yourself what's going well, what needs to be enhanced, and how you can continue to do it better. For one, because you'll learn, but two, the technology moves so quickly that you may actually need to make adjustments simply based on the speed and transformation of the underlying tech.
Does Morgan have an AI ethics board or something of that nature?
It's called the governance committee. It's effectively governs ethics. It's one of their responsibilities. I mean, its specific responsibility is it oversees the responsible deployment of AI, and that includes things such as model validity, privacy controls, cyber. So ethics is a component of that, but it's part of a broader set of features, if you will, that are governed under that broader mandate. Ethics being one of several things that are obviously important in the responsible deployment of AI.
So there are peers of yours who are listening, trying to figure this out too. Let's say the governance, etc. Is it all internal based, or are there external experts also in there? What is a good mix according to you for others?
I would first be cautious of anyone that really calls themselves an expert in a space that is literally, we're talking months, not years or even decades of experience. And I was recently at OpenAI and saw a bunch of unnamed consulting firms that were being trained on this technology that are very likely going to be out in your offices in the next few weeks selling you on several $1 million projects. And no disrespect to them, they're learning as well. So the first thing is and I'm making a general comment, is that there are very few experts. So be cautious is my first comment. We have generally found, given that we were the first financial institution, much of what we did is we had to rely on our own internal expertise. I don't want to act like, deploying complicated technology in a regulated environment is something new for a large-scale financial institution like Morgan Stanley. We have lots of very, very competent people in our legal, compliance, and risk department that are very familiar with this. And in some ways, one could argue that has been an advantage to the financial services industry because this is not a new problem to us. So, to answer your question specifically, I think that number one, there's a lot of good information out there in the marketplace around how to establish policies, how to establish ethics. And I think that's worth using. If you have identified a resource that has actually done this in practice, I would just make sure and kick the tires that they have done this in practice in a similar situation as yours. But I would say to most people, the biggest challenge with AI is not the AI, it's the organizational constructs. And we can probably talk about this. And nobody knows your organizational better than you do. And while I can probably teach you AI in a few weeks, I can teach you how to prompt, I can teach you what the transformer architecture is, I can teach you how to use this technology. It's not that hard because if you know how to speak and read, you too can be a prompt engineer. The reason people are failing is not because of their understanding of the underlying technology. They're failing for the same reasons they've been failing since the beginning of digital transformation: a lack of organizational focus, a lack of leadership, a lack of engagement, clarity of strategy, linking the technology to the goals and objectives of the organization. In some ways, it's the same problem. And what I would say to any organization: don't get too wrapped up in the specifics of the technology. What I would say is bring your best people together, set clear, defined objectives, learn from what's out in the marketplace where you can. If you can bring outside help in, great. If you can't, then do your best to figure it out. Start small, right, with little pieces, and then grow over time. And you'll learn as you go. But I can't stress that the most important thing that will prevent you from success is not your knowledge of the tech, it's your own ability to execute change effectively in your organization.
Does the chief compliance or the chief legal or the general counsel have a role in this? Because we are talking about a completely new paradigm. I'm talking about large Fortune 500 companies.
We have a global head of legal compliance at Morgan Stanley. Are they involved in our day-to-day committees? No. Are they involved in establishing the infrastructure that we put in place? 100%. Do we update them on a regular basis on the progress? And do we bring issues and concerns to them on a regular basis? Yes. So when we established the solution, the infrastructure, when we identified who the committee and oversight would be, all those folks were involved. And are they updated on a very regular basis? 100%. I mean, and particularly, as you talk about, and I'm sure we'll talk about this more, there's an inherent conflict between how much controls, what degree of controls you put in place to ensure that people make zero errors, and how much flexibility you let people, how much flexibility and independence you give people to let them run. And depending on what side of that trade you are on, you will complain about the other side of that trade, right? So having senior leaders on the business and on the second line controls at the table and being able to escalate not theoretical issues, but real issues, such that those issues don't swirl for months with 5 or 6 lawyers in 6 or 7 countries, so that people can make a pragmatic decision, what makes sense for the business, balancing the risks, but balancing the needs of the business and finding a proper. At sometimes the only people that can make those decisions is your chief counsel. And being able to take those issues that bubble up and bring them to the most senior people at the firm such that those decisions can get made in a thoughtful way, I have found to be really, really important, because in many cases, a simple 1-hour meeting where all of the issues are raised with that group of people, those issues can get resolved very quickly. But it does require a senior group of people to ultimately to weigh in, think about the implications to the firm, and in some cases need to go to the firm-wide risk committee as well, right? Where we can memorialize those issues and reflect those decisions on behalf of the firm. So I think what I guess my message is you need all the right people that are empowered to make choices, but you need to have a mechanism to escalate quickly when and if you kind of hit a roadblock so that the senior folks can be informed, educated, and that they can make the call.
How would you characterize the sweet spot between ability to move fast and governance, the innovation versus how does one balance? That's a question that comes up on our podcast all the time.
Too much AI too fast is a risk, right? And we need to sort of balance that with the right level of controls. And by the way, I'm not here to say that there is not risks associated with AI, and we can talk about them, and we do a lot of work to mitigate them. But one of the things that I think is important to acknowledge is there is a risk of moving too slow with AI. And the reason I say that, putting aside the commercial risks of being left behind, one of the things that I don't think people fully appreciate is one of the most significant beneficiaries of this technology are the control functions, the risk and control functions in a financial services organization. Because what AI allows you to do is the ability to monitor, surveil, control, and reduce the standard deviation on the quality of output is incredibly, that's what AI, or generative AI in particular, is quite effective at doing that. So the first point I would make, Sanjay, is that we need to acknowledge that AI is going to help us improve the risk posture of a financial services firm in aggregate, not decrease. And moving slowly prevents us from ultimately getting to that point. So that's the first point I make. The second point I'd make is that it's very hard to argue hypotheticals, right? It's very hard to argue about the future of AI and the future problems of AI or the future benefits of AI. AI is just a tool. So the first thing you have to do when you look at a project is you have to assess the degree of risk associated with that technology. So the first thing is that you have to understand the risks associated with each of these things. And what you find is a lot of these things do not require a massive amount of overhead because the risk is quite low. And then once you've established the level of risk, then you can have a tangible, meaningful conversation about what level of controls, monitoring, testing is necessary. And then you can actually have a real debate as to whether or not this is too much or too little. And my point is that focus on the actual real issues. Like put your template together, but then actually do real work and ask yourself, what are the real risks of this technology? What are the mitigants I need to put in place? And what is the appropriate amount of governance I need to mitigate those things? And sometimes you will find that's a very low standard, and sometimes that's a very high standard. And I think if you can get agreement on what those standards are, and you get both sides of the equation understanding what those rules are, then you're able to start to create a process that's more efficient, that's well understood on both sides. The expectations are clear, and and people are educated on what needs to happen, and people stop arguing and they start doing and executing. And I think that's really what's the most important thing.
Jeff, before I get into another point, does shadow AI concern you in an organization like Morgan at all?
First of all, you have to be very clear on what your policies are. It is no different. In some ways, your employees, and by the way, we haven't talked about this before, and maybe we won't, I don't know. The single most important thing that any organization can do right now is educate their employees. They should educate their employees on what AI is, how to prompt, and what is the responsible use of this technology. I can't stress that enough. And if you have $100 to spend right now, the first thing 90 of it I would spend on education. And I would spend 90 of that before I would even spend it on building any technology. I can't, and if I had to do it over again, I would spend more money on education, right? Because until people, both from an effectiveness and a responsible use of technology, until they really understand how to use this technology, they cannot leverage it fully, nor do they really understand what the risks are. So just to take a big step back. So to that point on shadow, number one, you really have to you have to teach your employees how to use this technology. You have to teach them what the risks are, and then two, one of the things that we're also working towards is having AI check the AI, right? So we're moving to a world where you will be able to surveil the behavior of people using alternative models, right? So whereas before you had to completely rely on that training, which by the way is important and critical and you need to do, but we're at the point now where I can actually look at every prompt that goes into the system. I can look at every prompt that comes out of the system. I can train the AI to look for certain types of anomalous behavior. I can train the AI on our code of conduct. So I guess what again, this is another example where AI is actually going to improve my risk mitigation controls at a place like Morgan Stanley, not decrease them factually. And I think we have to be creative. So yes, we want to empower people in the use of these tools because they will drive value. But I think we also, at the same time, we have to equivalently raise the bar around the proper level of controls and monitoring. And I think where people will get in trouble is when they democratize, but they don't put the training in place. They don't put the guardrails in place. They don't put the monitoring in place, right? It's when one side of the equation moves too quickly without the other side catching up. And that's why I think both are so critical for an effective, AI ecosystem.
Jeff, just one quick point on that. Do you think AI is a bottom up technology or is it a top down technology?
It's my job to create the infrastructure, to provide the tooling, to provide the education, to provide the guardrails, and make sure we've got the whole ecosystem to both empower people and ensure that this thing is done responsibly. That's my job, and that's the job of my team, and educating and then obviously learning. We were just out in the West Coast. We probably met with 100 companies 3 weeks ago, trying to stay ahead and seeing what's the latest in the marketplace and the vendors and the models and whatever, right? So that's the job of my team. But but I'm not the innovator. Innovation happens with the people that have the expertise, and I think that's the thing that I don't think people fully appreciate is that what's happening in the marketplace is that 5 years ago, if you and I wanted to do something in our business, we needed $300,000 and a team of 3 developers and 3 months. And we wrote requirements documents and then a technical specification, and then you gave it to the developers, and then 6 weeks later they'd come back and you would complain that they didn't give you what they want, and then the developers would say that you didn't write it correctly, and then you'd kind of cycle through until you ran out of money, and then you would claim the project is done. I mean, that's a lot of how tech works, right? In 2025, much of that work will happen by you turning to the left and saying to some young person on your team, can you think about this? Or better yet, they may just independently say, you know what, I want to do something to make this client relationship better, or I want to improve the way the compliance alerts come out of the system, or I want to do some analysis of this data, and I'm just gonna play around with this for a little bit. And I think, if you want to call that shadow AI, I call that democratization of these tools. And I think when you're getting this technology in the hands of real experts, that's when you're really starting to drive value, right? when the person is able to not only create the requirements, but build the solution and evaluate the solution and test the solution and deploy the solution, and then use the solution to drive value in their business, it's a completely different paradigm. And we're already seeing that. I think that's what's really exciting. And I often say that the thing that I'm most excited about is the thing I can't see yet. It's the thing that someone's going to build or the solution that someone's going to place that hasn't been built yet, that they're going to be able to build because of their knowledge and expertise of the business and their creativity and their level of innovation and their excitement. And more of that stuff is happening. So that's, I'm the top down with the infrastructure and the controls and the guardrails, and the bottom up is the inspiration and the creativity of the employees that have access to these tools. And hopefully, the partnership of those two things is what drives value.
Jeff, Morgan Stanley emphasizes human centric generative AI. What does that actually mean operationally? Because different people have a very different view from that. What would it take for it not just to become a corporate value statement, but beyond that?
So, one of our AI principles, I think I mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, is we say human in the loop is actually what we say. And what that means is that I'll give you two examples. If you are to use, one of our intelligent assistants to answer a question, we give you that question, we give you the answer to that question, we give you a link to the document, we give you the fragments of the document that source that information. If for some reason the AI were to answer your question incompletely or potentially inaccurately, which by the way happens very infrequently now, we have very low degrees of hallucination for a whole bunch of different reasons, which I could share. But let's say, these machines make mistakes, no different than humans do. That is your responsibility as the employee. The AI made the mistake. It's the AI's fault. Similarly, if you're a process owner that's processing new account opening, and the system does a bunch of stuff, and you're the sales assistant, and the new account opening form comes to you, and maybe there's a piece of information at the end of the process that got put in incorrectly. First of all, you're going to be the one to submit that. The AI doesn't press the button, right? That's kind of one of our quotes. The humans press the button. Now, the AI may prepare all the documents, it may fill in the form, but that form is ultimately submitted by a human. All the information, first of all, that human knows that AI was used in the preparation of that form. All of the information that went into it has links to the underlying source information to include the fragments associated with it. So we give full transparency, and you are accountable, right? And I think what's interesting is that the nature of jobs are somewhat changing in the sense that historically the junior level job was the person to capture and type it into a machine. That job is moving from that job to being the person who is validating information. And the person who before was validating information is now the person that's starting to synthesize the information. And the person that was synthesizing is now the person that's sort of thinking about how to presenting that. You know what I mean? Like, so what we're seeing is sort of the lower end stuff is moving away, and then everybody's job is kind of moving up. But going back to your point, human-centric approach means that humans are in the loop, that they own and are accountable for everything they output. And then from a responsibility perspective, from an engagement, like, we don't just leave them on their own. They are given all of the relevant information to help them make sure that they're able to audit that information, and that they're fully aware of like what went into the recipe that got them the output that they did. And that's on me and my team.
Okay, so the human in the loop, I think, is a critical aspect. Jeff, with AI is increasingly shaping lending, wealth management, investment decisions. Given the scope of what all you do, how does one proactively detect and mitigate bias before it impacts clients? I mean, I've had leaders of foundation companies tell me that there is going to be some level of bias because that's just a fact. But what is your perspective on this?
First of all, there are actual regulations in the banking sector that require us to prevent any type of, for example, lending. So this is not, again, a new concept for us. And the short answer is we have a whether there is a legal obligation or just a general responsible obligation, we need to make sure that our models are operating as independently as they possibly can. And again, to your point, we live in a world with lots of different influences. These models are a function of human training, which has in and of itself many biases. I would say two things. Number one, when we build stuff, and if there is bias associated or concerns around it, we will do adversarial testing, independent adversarial testing, to essentially root that out. And if and when we identify issues of that, we will work to mitigate it. The second thing is I would say, and I know this is maybe a little bit of a technical point, we generally don't rely on the models as sources of information as much as we rely them as sources of language. I call it language computation. And what I mean by that is we rely on the knowledge and content and data of Morgan Stanley that is fed into the large language models, which is then retrieved back to give us the answers. And by doing that, and by only feeding it the knowledge of Morgan Stanley, we are able to substantially reduce issues around bias. Traditionally, where you have more of an issue with bias is in what I'm going to say traditional machine learning algorithms, where they are trained on a subset of a population that is a demographic. And in those cases, we actually will do testing. We will actually formally do testing against populations, age, race, and whatnot, gender. And we will actually test those models to see if they are distributing a product or service or a loan disproportionately to that demographic population. And in those cases, it'll actually be quantifiable. But in the case of large language models, if we're doing something that has any form of concern around that, and some stuff does, and candidly, some stuff doesn't, then you actually have to test. Because the whole point with these large language models is you can't go into the model itself. You can't actually quantify the percentage of this algorithm and that it's doing this versus that. So you have to go in, you have to give 100 people, a chance to ask 20 questions, and you'll say, listen, can you try to break it? Try to break it. Try to get it to say something you don't want it to say, and see what happens. And we do a lot of that. And sometimes it results in finding things that, you don't want it to find, and then you got to go and fix them. And sometimes it doesn't. But either way, I think my message to people is if you, first of all, you should always be asking upfront, what are the risks? And one of your risks is bias. And there's many other risks. And if you have that concern, then you have to actively work to try to find it in the solution that you're building.
Do you have any concerns? I mean, you're taking your data with these large language models, foundation models, in terms of explainability at all, Jeff?
I think the better question is, how does a regulated institution deal with the fact that there is no explainability on these models? And I think the answer is you have to take what we call as an input and output approach. So you say, I'm going to take 100 questions, and then I'm going to take 100 answers that I know are good answers. And I'm going to see how the AI does against it. Does it get 100 out of 100 right, or does it get 50 out of 100 right? And if it gets 50 out of 100 right, why did it get 50 out of 100? And what do I need to do? Is it a data quality problem? Is it a prompting problem? Is it a source problem? Like, what is the problem? And then what you end up doing is you use a combination of prompts, adjustment of the content, and you continue to sort of adjust those things till you sort of get to the 80s, the 90s, the 99s, right? And then once you get to sort of that high degree of confidence, then you're in a position to give it to people. And then you get 20 or 30 experts, and this is really important. You have to get your best people. You can't get your sort of low end, temps to do this work. You need your best people. You want your best AI, you need your best people to engage. And then you have them input information and to do output. And then they evaluate. And we actually have tools that do this. They literally will say good, bad, and if it's bad, they have to describe why. The team collects all the bad answers. They look at it, they think about it, they make changes to prompts, they make changes to content, and then they'll go ahead on a Friday afternoon, update the prompts, update the content, and then they'll do it again. Now, what happens, Sanjay, sometimes is you'll fix one problem, and then you'll create a different problem, right? Because this is not like this is not linear technology, right? It's non-deterministic. So, in some cases, you can solve this in a couple of weeks. It may take you a couple of months. It may take you 12 or 15 turns and going through this. And it's really a function of how complicated is the problem and what is the quality of output that you need. And so this input output approach is the approach that honestly, it's the only way to do it. You can't just have people say, yeah, it looks pretty good to me. You've got to be very disciplined. You have to audit the information. You've got to keep it in a location. And then at the end of that process, somebody's got to say, you know what? This is of a level of quality that I'm comfortable enough to go live with. And then, by the way, then you've got to put monitoring in place to make sure that on an ongoing basis, these systems are performing consistently of a high quality. And by the way, like, you've heard me say this, like, this is real work. Like, I don't think people necessarily appreciate, like, it's not like, I think sometimes people think like AI is find me the best dim sum place in Hong Kong, right? Like, what I'm describing you is a very complicated process that requires a lot of time and effort. I mean, it's not complicated so much. It is just a lot of work with a lot of smart people and a lot of time. But that's what it takes to really create high quality systems.
When you say bring your best people, do they have to be cross-functional, or what do you mean by that?
I think it really depends. I think what I would say is, if you're building whatever system you are building, who are the people that know that system? So yes, maybe cross-functional. If you're building a compliance system, you probably need compliance people. If you're building a banking system, maybe if there are compliance people that have specific expertise in that system. Again, Mike, I don't know anyone in this podcast organization, but if you're building something, you should ask the question, who are the people that know the most about this thing? And the only point I would just highlight is that those very same people are the very same people that are probably doing really valuable stuff elsewhere. And it is hard for leaders to free up the capacity of those very strong people. And where I'm seeing the most success is when leaders are willing to take the hit and actually extract very senior, successful, maybe revenue driving or senior risk people or whatever, that they're able to extract them from their organization on a part-time or even full-time basis and dedicating them to the effective deployment of these tools.
So bring your best experts, a lot of input, output, a lot of hard work. Jeff, just quickly, a final point on that, synthetic data. Any thoughts on that from your standpoint?
You can actually use Gen AI to create pretty decent synthetic data. So for example, I'll give you an example. If you wanted to, let's say you wanted to get it going and you didn't have all your call transcripts. Let's say it was going to take you 3 months to get all access to the call transcript because you had to get through security and architecture and all these issues. You might be able to take, a dozen or so anonymized call transcripts, use Gen AI to create 10,000 of them, right? adjusting the topics, adjusting the tone, adjusting. And while they may not be perfect, right? They will create, I mean, for something like that, they'll create a representative sample. Another example is like you could create 500 trust agreements anonymized with fake names, right? That would be pretty good. Gen AI does really well on commonly produced contracts, trusts, living will. I'm talking about things in my space, but if it's content that is also, database schemas, you can do stuff. If you sort of give it examples, I mean, where Gen AI really does well is say, okay, I've got a schema that looks like this. The distribution looks like this. I want you to create 10 million records that looks like this because I want to do performance testing. Those types of things it does really well. The only thing that I would just say is that for all of the great work synthetic data does, and it's very helpful, it will help you get moving. I would be very hesitant to fully go live with a system without actually doing real testing, because inevitably synthetic data is synthetic. And if you're going to really identify the true issues before you actually flip the switch, I would strongly advise that you want to actually do real stuff. And that may be me running in what we call prod parallel. That may be actually taking real stuff through the system, but not in a production environment, in like a test environment for maybe 2 or 3 months, and sort of running them in 2 different systems, see how they will do against each other. Whatever it is don't assume that synthetic data will flesh out all the issues, but certainly helpful to get you moving.
We have a patchwork around the world of AI policies. When you look at EU AI Act, you look in the US, we don't have a federal policy. We have now states that are jumping in. Um, Yours is a global organization that has to make sure it's complying with. How difficult does it make it from that standpoint? And because if it is difficult for you, think about small companies, etc. And this is something that, when I have lawmakers, policymakers from around the world on there, I kind of bring it up. Because a lot of them are going to be listening to you. What are your thoughts on that?
When I want to turn on my system for recording meetings, I had to do a 23 jurisdiction analysis. It took me 9 months, right? I had to go through every single country and understand every single rule because, by the way, like Morgan Stanley, we care, right? We're not going to simply just say, well, we'll let it see how it goes, right? We are respectful to the regulations of every jurisdiction. The EUA Act has a whole set of requirements. It does not, I want to be clear, it does not stop us from doing anything specifically, but it probably adds 6 months to every timeline that I have because of the work that I have to do in terms of documenting service level agreements between the legal entities in Europe and the US, putting the right controls in place. And I'm not here to argue whether any of those laws are good or not. I think I'll leave that for other folks to debate. But I will tell you, it is really hard. And we have a lot of folks on our team whose only job is to keep abreast of every country's emerging regulatory AI, by the way, to include the states. California just came out with something new. And really trying to do our very best to make sure that we're always, in front of that stuff and adhering to it. But I will tell you, it is very, very hard, and it definitely costs us a lot of time. And candidly, I'm not necessarily sure it's always helping the intended purpose.
How were your experiences in West Point in the US Army? Did they shape any of your approaches to leading AI initiatives at Morgan Stanley?
Well, I wasn't expecting that one, Sanjay. Well, first of all, we're recording this around Veterans Day. So first of all, happy Veterans Day, and I want to thank all the veterans out there for their service. And by the way, sorry to do this unabashed plug, Sanjay, but if anybody wants to help a veteran, help them transition from the military into the civilian world, open up your network, help them find a job. We do a lot of work here at Morgan Stanley to try to help veterans, and I would just encourage your audience around the world, any country, to support your veteran community. That being said, I would say three things. Number one, I think it was Eisenhower who had a great quote that plans are useless, but planning is everything. And I've always loved that quote because you have to be disciplined and organized. You have to bring the right people together. You have to have a standard operating procedure, guiding principles. You have to have a program management office. You need structure, accountability. You absolutely have to do that, and you have to be locked in. And then all that being said, as soon as you put that together, you realize that the problem that you thought you were solving for is actually not the problem. You realize the technology that you thought you were bringing in is not the technology. You realize that the risks that you thought you were solving for are not the risks. And then you have to adjust. And I think the act of being organized and structured allowed you to come together as a team and then appropriately pivot and deal with the unknown as it came up. So I'm not in any way suggesting just let it fly. I am saying be organized, be structured, but I'm also saying be flexible. So that would be number one. The second thing I would say, when I was a young officer, they would do these training sessions, and they would have eight actual battles, and one of those 8 battles was scored at 50% of your total grade, and that battle is the one where you, as the officer, were taken out of the battle. So meaning that your soldiers were operating without you as a leader. And the point they were making is that the effectiveness of your unit without you there was the greatest indication of how well your organization was. And that I've often said to my team and even my boss that every day that my team becomes less relevant is a better day for Morgan Stanley. Because what we're trying to do is we're not trying to create an AI czar or this AI power center. What we're trying to do is we're trying to empower people to use this technology in a responsible way. And that success for me is success for other people, right? It's not about Jeff McMillan. It's not about my team, right? It's about giving this tool and letting people do what they need to do in a proper, controlled way. And any success that happens at this firm, I feel great about, right? Even if I don't touch it. And some of the most things I'm most proud about are the things that just sort of like, wow, that happened. And I didn't even I wasn't anywhere near it, right? And I think what good leadership is about setting up it's about setting up environments where people can succeed and creating cultures where people collaborate and work together. That was true 30 years ago, and I think it's true today. Last thing I'll say, Sanjay, and I know this may sound a little trite, but one of the things I learned in the military is if you've showered in the last 7 days, if you've eaten in the last 24 hours, if you're not getting rained on, and you've been able to change your socks in the last week, that you're having a good day. And the thing I learned in the military is that, that's work, right? And by the way, nobody got shot at today here at Morgan Stanley. And we're pretty safe and we're pretty secure. And we've got a lot to be thankful for. I think probably maybe the greatest lesson is that, perspective, right? And I think, if anything, I'm grateful for the maybe some of the challenges I had experienced. I was in South Korea and some other places, cold and wet and damp and other things. And I certainly am much more appreciative of my time not in a foxhole in the middle of winter, today, than I was then. And I think that experience has made me much more, I guess, a little bit more humble and more grateful.
Great messages. First, I think a very important one is, as you said, around the world, if you can help a veteran transition, I think that's the most important in whatever way, jobs, opportunities, training, etc. And I think Jeff talked about a few things that he picked up, which are very, very valuable. Be structured yet flexible, empower the team, be thankful and have perspective, Jeff, I think is what you're saying. And that's stood you so very well, Jeff. And thanks, Jeff, for bringing such clarity, such pragmatism and wisdom to such a critical questions about AI governance, which are rooted really in managing AI at such a large scale of a regulated industry. And you offer a bridge between the theory and the practical realities that companies, policymakers face every day. And the stakes for getting AI governance right are enormous. As I think you said, the decisions we make in the next 12, 24 months will really make a difference whether AI becomes a tool for broadly shared prosperity and innovation, or it becomes a growing sense of inequality, and we need voices like yours. So thank you so much for this. And to our listeners, AI policy leaders, entrepreneurs, I hope you walked away with a deeper understanding that responsible AI isn't a constraint on innovation. It's a foundation for sustainable and trustworthy innovation. And we really have to thank Jeff for that. Jeff, thank you, Jeff.
Really thank you, Sanjay. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks for tuning in to the Regulating AI podcast with Sanjay Puri. If you enjoyed today's conversation, don't forget to leave a comment. We'd love to hear what you thought. Share it with someone curious about the future of AI, and join us next time for more stories and insights from the leaders shaping what's ahead, right here on the Regulating AI podcast.